Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are sitting in a small room. The walls are plain, no chains, no blood, no screams, nothing that looks like torture. A clock is ticking somewhere, but you cannot see it. You are not being questioned. No one is shouting at you. No one is hurting you. Yet behind a thick glass window, unseen by you, a group of men are watching. They are calm, focused. One of them writes something on a clipboard. Another checks a stopwatch. They are not asking whether you are innocent or guilty. They are asking something far more disturbing. How long can this human being endure discomfort, fear, isolation, uncertainty, and pain before the mind begins to collapse, not to save you, not to punish you, but to measure you? This story does not begin with cruelty, it begins with fear. After the Second World War, the United States emerged as one of the most powerful nations on Earth, but power did not bring peace. It brought paranoia. A new enemy had appeared, one that did not fight openly on battlefields. The Cold War turned the world into a chessboard of secrets, spies, and psychological warfare. American intelligence agencies were flooded with alarming reports. Prisoners of war in enemy countries were returning, changed. Some refused to speak. Some appeared emotionally broken. Some had lost their sense of identity. Rumors spread that rival nations had learned how to break the human mind without leaving visible scars. No whips, no wounds, just pressure. Inside classified meeting rooms, a terrifying concern took shape. What if the enemy understood human limits better than we did? What if they knew exactly how much suffering a person could endure and how to push just beyond that line? The question was never asked in public. It was never written in newspapers. But behind closed doors, it echoed loudly. If we don't understand the limits of human suffering, how can we defend ourselves? From that moment, pain stopped being only a human experience. It became a research variable. The idea was framed carefully, almost politely. Officials spoke of resilience, stress tolerance, and behavior under extreme conditions. These were not presented as acts of cruelty, but as necessary steps for national survival. In this new logic, suffering was no longer a moral issue. It was a measurement problem. How long before exhaustion becomes confusion? How long before isolation turns into hallucination? How long before fear overrides reason? And so, quietly, without a single public announcement, a shadowy research philosophy was born. To protect the nation, we must understand how humans break. The program did not have a single official name known to the public. It was scattered across departments, hidden inside military research, intelligence studies, and medical experiments. Paperwork was classified, language was sanitized. What sounded brutal in plain words was softened into technical terms. Sleep deprivation became extended wakefulness studies. Isolation became sensory restriction. Pain became stress exposure. And most importantly, the subjects were never called victims. They were called data points. At first, the experiments were small, short durations, controlled environments. Researchers convinced themselves that they were being cautious. Ethical lines were blurred, then quietly erased, because once the door opens, it rarely closes again. The people chosen for these early studies were not random. They were selected precisely because their suffering would not cause public outrage. Prisoners whose voices carried no weight, patients in mental institutions already labeled as unstable. Soldiers told they were participating in training exercises for their own good. Consent was a flexible word. Information was withheld. Risks were minimized in explanation, not in reality. Participants were rarely told the full purpose of what they were enduring, and slowly, something changed inside the program. What began as defensive research turned into curiosity. Researchers noticed patterns. They saw that physical pain was not always the breaking point. In many cases, uncertainty was worse, isolation was worse. The absence of control did more damage than any single injury. A human being, they learned, could endure an incredible amount of physical discomfort if the mind believed there was an end. But remove the sense of time, remove certainty, remove meaning, and the mind began to unravel. This discovery was treated not as a warning, but as a breakthrough. If suffering could be extended without obvious damage, then it could be studied longer. If there were no visible scars, there would be fewer questions. Fewer questions meant fewer obstacles. And so the experiments deepened. Sessions became longer, conditions became harsher, observations became colder. Researchers documented changes in speech, posture, eye movement. They tracked when subjects stopped asking questions, when they stopped resisting, when they stopped caring. There was a moment noted again and again in internal reports when a person would simply withdraw, not unconscious, not dead, just empty. That moment fascinated them, because it suggested that the human spirit had a measurable breaking point. At no stage did the program officially describe itself as studying suffering. That word was avoided. Instead, they spoke of human limits. But limits of what if not suffering? Fear was the engine that kept the program alive. Fear of enemies, fear of being unprepared, fear of losing control. And fear has a way of justifying almost anything. By the time ethical concerns began to surface within smaller circles, the program had already embedded itself too deeply. Too many departments were involved, too much data had been collected, too many careers depended on its continuation. Stopping it would raise questions no one wanted to answer. Who approved this? Who participated? Who suffered? So instead of stopping, the program adapted. It learned how to hide better. Experiments were fragmented. Records were compartmentalized. Even many participants within the system did not know the full picture. Pain was no longer inflicted in obvious ways. It was engineered, a room slightly colder than normal. Lights left on without explanation, time schedules disrupted, human contact reduced to nothing. Small things, each harmless on paper, devastating in combination. The subjects were told they were being monitored for safety. In reality, they were being monitored for endurance. And every hour, every reaction, every breakdown was logged. Because somewhere deep inside the machinery of power, the original question still demanded an answer. How long can a human suffer? By the end of this first phase, the program had proven something chilling. There was no universal limit. Different people broke in different ways. Some resisted longer than expected. Some collapsed quickly. Background, belief, isolation, hope, everything mattered. Suffering was complex, which meant the research could go further. And it did, not with hesitation, but with confidence. This is where part 1 ends. This is where the shift happens. Because once the origin was established, once the method seemed validated, the program moved into a far darker phase. In the next part, the question would no longer be why this program existed. It would be this: who exactly were chosen to endure it, and why their suffering was considered acceptable. The people chosen to endure this were never called victims inside official files. They were called subjects. That single word made everything easier, because subjects could be selected. Subjects could be managed, subjects could be replaced. The program needed humans who could be pushed hard without triggering public attention, legal backlash, or moral outrage. So it looked for people whose pain would remain invisible. Prisons were an obvious starting point. Inmates were already controlled, already isolated, already stripped of credibility. Many were told participation would reduce their sentence, improve their treatment, or help science. Others were never given a real choice at all. Paperwork existed, but it was vague, technical, and deliberately incomplete. What mattered was not consent. What mattered was availability. Mental health institutions came next. At the time, patients inside these facilities were often treated as less than fully human. Their testimony was easily dismissed. If someone complained about suffering, it could be written off as a symptom of their condition. Inside those walls, suffering blended seamlessly into routine. Then there were soldiers, young, healthy. Obedient, they were told these were resilience tests, survival training, preparation for extreme conditions. Many believed they were helping protect their country. Few were informed about the psychological risks. Almost none were told how far the experiments would go. And finally, there were people who never appeared in official recruitment lists at all. The marginalized, the poor, those who depended on the system for food, shelter, or care. When participation is tied to survival, refusal becomes meaningless. What united all these groups was not weakness, but silence. No press conferences followed their suffering. No families were informed in detail. No headlines questioned their treatment. Inside observation rooms, researchers began to see them not as individuals but as profiles. Age, background, education, mental state, they searched for patterns. Who resisted longer? Who broke faster? Who adapted? Who deteriorated? And slowly, quietly, a hierarchy of endurance began to form. The program learned that suffering was not just physical. In fact, physical pain alone often failed to produce the results they wanted. Bodies adapted, pain dulled, muscles recovered, but the mind behaved differently. Isolation became one of the most powerful tools. Subjects were placed alone for extended periods. No clocks, no windows, no sense of day or night, meals delivered at irregular times. Human voices removed entirely. At first, many tried to maintain routines. They counted steps, they sang quietly, they talked to themselves. Researchers watched closely. After days, sometimes weeks, something shifted. Thoughts became repetitive, memories blurred. Some subjects began to hallucinate sounds or movements. Others developed intense emotional swings, rage followed by despair, hope followed by emptiness. The breaking point was rarely dramatic, it was subtle. A subject would stop asking questions. Stop reacting to discomfort, stop caring whether anyone was watching. That moment was carefully documented. Sleep deprivation pushed the process further. Subjects were kept awake for extended periods under the justification of alertness testing. Lights were adjusted. Noise was introduced at random intervals. Physical harm was minimal, but mental strain was relentless. Without sleep, reality softened, time lost meaning, thoughts disconnected, fear intensified. Some subjects begged to be allowed to sleep. Others became eerily calm, detached from their surroundings. A few collapsed entirely, requiring medical intervention, not to end the experiment, but to preserve the subject for continued observation. Because death was not the goal, endurance was. As data accumulated, the program refined its methods. Pain was no longer applied directly. It was engineered through environment, uncertainty, and control. Researchers learned that unpredictability amplified suffering more effectively than intensity. A mild stressor repeated without explanation caused more damage than a severe one with a clear endpoint, so rules changed constantly. A subject allowed to speak one day would be punished for speaking the next. A routine meal schedule would suddenly disappear. Comfort, once given, would be abruptly taken away. Hope was introduced strategically, then removed. This cycle proved devastating. The human mind, desperate for patterns, struggled to adapt. Anxiety increased, trust eroded, identity weakened. Subjects began to doubt their own perceptions. Was this intentional? Was I imagining it? Did I do something wrong? That doubt was the real experiment. Because once a person stops trusting their own mind, resistance becomes almost impossible. Inside reports, researchers wrote about compliance thresholds and cognitive surrender. They noted how long it took before a subject accepted suffering as normal, accepted it as deserved, accepted it as permanent. Ethical concerns did surface from time to time. A few researchers questioned the long-term effects, some worried about irreversible damage. But those voices were quiet and often temporary. The data was too valuable, the fear was too strong, the momentum was unstoppable, and there was always a justification ready. This knowledge could save lives, this could protect soldiers, this could prevent future atrocities. Suffering, reframed as sacrifice, became acceptable. By this stage, the program had moved beyond observation. It was actively shaping suffering. And what came next would push the boundaries even further, not just measuring how long humans could endure, but discovering how suffering could be prolonged without visible collapse. That is where the next phase begins, and that is where the program truly crossed the line from research into something far darker. What came next was no longer about discovering limits. It was about learning how to stay just below them. By the time the program entered this phase, researchers understood something crucial: complete collapse ended observation. A broken subject could no longer produce useful data. What they wanted now was not destruction, but controlled endurance. Suffering that could be extended, suffering that could be maintained. So the methods evolved again, quieter, cleaner, more precise. The environment became the weapon. Rooms were designed to feel almost normal, yet subtly wrong. Temperatures were adjusted just enough to cause discomfort without triggering alarms. Air circulation was altered so that subjects felt slightly breathless, but not endangered. Lighting was kept constant, depriving the body of natural rhythm. There was no single moment of pain, there was only constant unease. Subjects were denied any sense of progression, no calendars. No clocks, no indication of how long they had been there or how much longer it would last. Without time, suffering became endless, even if the experiment itself had limits. Researchers noted something unsettling. When humans cannot measure time, they begin to lose themselves. Memory fractured, events blurred together. Subjects struggled to recall what happened yesterday or whether yesterday even existed. Conversations, when allowed, became circular and confused. This was not accidental. Confusion was the point. Control over information became absolute. Subjects were told contradictory things by different handlers. One would say the experiment was nearly over. Another would suggest it had barely begun. Medical staff spoke in calm, reassuring tones, even as conditions quietly worsened. Trust was manipulated carefully. A friendly voice could undo weeks of resistance. A sudden betrayal could crush hope instantly. Researchers observed how quickly attachment formed under isolation, how a single human interaction could become a lifeline. And once that bond existed, it could be used. Privileges were introduced, a chair instead of the floor, silence instead of noise, a few minutes of conversation, then they were taken away. The removal hurt more than the deprivation itself. Subjects learned that comfort was temporary and conditional, that obedience might bring relief, that resistance only prolonged discomfort. Slowly behavior changed, posture slumped, eye contact faded, speech became hesitant then sparse. Some subjects tried to assert control in small ways, refusing food, counting breaths, repeating phrases. Researchers noted these behaviors as coping mechanisms and adjusted conditions to disrupt them. Even coping was not allowed to stabilize. Psychological pressure replaced physical pain almost entirely. Threats were rarely explicit. Instead, implications were enough, a mention of extended duration. A suggestion that cooperation would help things go smoother. A casual remark about how others had stayed longer by resisting. Fear filled the gaps. The mind, desperate to escape uncertainty, began to cooperate on its own. And then there was isolation within isolation. Some subjects were allowed brief contact with others, just enough to remember what connection felt like. Then they were separated again, often without explanation. The emotional impact was immediate and severe. Loss hit harder after hope. Researchers documented sharp declines in mental stability after these separations. Depression deepened, anxiety spiked. Hallucinations increased, but still most subjects did not break completely. They adapted. This fascinated the observers. Humans, it seemed, could normalize almost anything if it lasted long enough. So the program pushed further. Sleep schedules were manipulated not just to deprive rest, but to fragment it. Short periods of sleep followed by sudden awakening. Dreams interrupted repeatedly. The boundary between sleep and waking life dissolved. Subjects reported vivid nightmares bleeding into reality. Some were unsure whether they were awake or dreaming. Others stopped trying to distinguish the two. This state proved especially vulnerable. Suggestions made during this phase carried unusual weight. Simple statements could feel profound. Casual remarks could shape belief. Researchers were careful not to call it influence. They called it observation. Medical oversight remained present but narrowly focused. Vital signs were monitored. Physical collapse was avoided. As long as the body functioned, the experiment continued. Mental damage was harder to quantify and easier to ignore. Some subjects cried constantly. Others became emotionally flat. A few laughed at inappropriate moments, disconnected from context. These reactions were recorded without comment. Suffering at this stage was normalized. It became routine. Handlers rotated to avoid emotional attachment. Language was standardized to reduce empathy. Faces remained calm, neutral, professional. The system did not see pain. It saw responses. At some point, even resistance lost its meaning. Subjects complied not because they believed, but because compliance required less effort. It hurt less. That realization marked a turning point. The program had learned how to prolong suffering indefinitely, without visible violence, without obvious cruelty, without leaving marks that could not be explained away. And that knowledge terrified even some within the system, because it meant there was no clear boundary anymore, no natural endpoint, just endurance stretched thin. This was the phase where whispers began to circulate internally, concerns about long-term damage, about what happened after the experiments ended, about whether subjects could ever return to normal life. Those questions were inconvenient because addressing them would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require accountability. So instead, the program prepared to do what it had always done best. It prepared to disappear. Disappearance did not mean stopping, it meant erasing. By the time concerns grew loud enough to be noticed, the program had already learned its most important survival skill: how to exist without being seen. There was no single switch to turn off, no central office to shut down. The research had been scattered deliberately, broken into fragments that looked harmless on their own. A study here, a training protocol there, a medical trial buried inside paperwork. No one document ever told the full story. When internal audits began to circle, files were revised, language was softened. Durations shortened on paper, outcomes reframed as inconclusive or within acceptable parameters. Data that hinted at severe psychological damage was quietly reclassified or removed entirely. Destruction was selective, not everything was burned or shredded. Some records were simply misplaced, others were transferred to departments with higher clearance. A few vanished into archives that required special authorization no one outside a small circle possessed. The goal was not to deny the research existed. The goal was to make it impossible to trace. Participants who asked questions after their release encountered silence. Medical follow-ups were minimal. Complaints were redirected, delayed, or dismissed. Many were told their symptoms were unrelated, temporary, or imagined. Gaslighting became policy. Without documentation, suffering lost its credibility. Some subjects tried to speak publicly. Their accounts were fragmented, emotional, difficult to verify. Against official denials and technical jargon, their voices sounded unstable. That was convenient. Institutions leaned on plausible explanations: stress, pre-existing conditions, personal weakness, anything but the truth. Inside the system, responsibility dissolved upward. Each department claimed it followed guidelines. Each researcher claimed oversight existed elsewhere. Each official insisted decisions were made above their level. No one felt accountable. Because accountability requires a clear line, and the program had erased its lines carefully. As years passed, attention shifted. New threats emerged. New priorities replaced old fears. What once seemed urgent became inconvenient history. Funding streams were renamed. Projects were absorbed into broader initiatives. The original purpose blurred until even many insiders no longer recognized it. But the damage did not blur. Former subjects struggled to reintegrate into normal life. Some experienced chronic anxiety. Others suffered severe insomnia, emotional numbness, or paranoia. Relationships collapsed. Careers ended quietly. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments. In a few rare cases, compensation was offered, but without admission of wrongdoing. Payments framed as settlements, not justice. Silence clauses attached. Speak and you lose everything. Families noticed changes but rarely understood the cause. Loved ones returned physically intact, yet profoundly altered. The absence of visible scars made explanations harder. How do you prove something designed to leave no marks? Within academic circles, fragments of the research surfaced indirectly. Concepts appeared in manuals. Techniques were referenced without origin. Knowledge migrated without history, and because it arrived stripped of context, it felt neutral, technical, safe. The people who had endured the experiments were never mentioned. By the time public curiosity brushed against these shadows, the trail was cold. Witnesses aged, memories faded, records were inaccessible or incomplete. What remained looked like coincidence, not design. This was the program's final achievement, not knowledge, not control, but silence. A silence built not by force, but by bureaucracy, by time. By the simple human tendency to look away from discomforting truths. Yet silence has a weakness. It cannot erase consequences. The suffering did not end when the experiments did. It continued in private, unrecorded ways, in nightmares, in broken trust, in lives permanently altered without explanation. And somewhere deep inside the system, an uncomfortable realization lingered. The program had proven how far humans could be pushed, but it had also proven something else, that a society could inflict immense suffering on its own people and then forget it ever happened. That realization would not stay buried forever, because what was hidden had a way of resurfacing. And when it did, it would force a final question, not about how long humans can suffer, but about what that suffering ultimately cost. What it ultimately cost was not written in any report, it lived inside people. Long after the rooms were emptied, long after the files were locked away, the consequences moved quietly through ordinary lives. Former subjects tried to return to routines that no longer fit them. Crowded places felt dangerous, silence felt loud, authority felt threatening. Many could not explain why. Their suffering had no language. Doctors treated symptoms, not causes. Anxiety, depression. Sleep disorders, emotional detachment. Treatments helped some, failed others. Few ever connected their condition to what they had endured because no official connection existed. Without acknowledgement, healing remained incomplete. Some survivors avoided thinking about the past altogether. Memory itself felt unsafe. Others became obsessed with understanding what had been done to them, searching archives, filing requests, chasing answers that never came. A few found fragments, a document with redacted lines, a reference number without explanation, a vague confirmation that something classified had occurred. Never enough. Time moved on, generations changed. The fear that once justified the program faded into history books. New threats replaced old ones, technology advanced, language evolved, but the knowledge gained from suffering did not disappear. It was absorbed, refined, reused. Techniques developed in secrecy influenced training manuals, interrogation methods, behavioral research. Stripped of origin, they seemed clean, professional. Necessary pain had been normalized, not because people approved of it, but because they no longer recognized it. The most unsettling truth was not that the program existed, it was that it worked. It demonstrated that humans could endure far more than anyone wanted to admit, that the mind could be bent without breaking completely. That suffering could be extended quietly, efficiently, and indefinitely under the right conditions, and once that knowledge exists, it cannot be undone. The question then becomes moral, not scientific. Just because something can be done, should it be? The program never stood trial. No single moment of reckoning arrived. No dramatic confession closed the chapter. Instead, it dissolved into the background of institutional memory, forgotten by design, yet the cost remained in the distrust of systems. In the quiet fear of authority, in the damaged lives that never made headlines, suffering had been studied, measured, optimized, but empathy had not, and that may be the most dangerous legacy of all. Because a society that learns how to inflict suffering without seeing it risks losing the ability to recognize it, even when it happens again. The final answer to the original question was never officially published. How long can humans suffer? The program learned that the answer depends less on biology and more on belief. Belief that someone is watching, belief that it will end, belief that it matters. Remove those beliefs and suffering stretches on, quietly, endlessly, and that knowledge now exists in the world. Whether we choose to confront it or repeat it is no longer a question for secret programs. It is a question for all of us.